So, to answer this question, let's just imagine we are talking about a Cessna 172, the most popular little small airplane that everybody loves to fly. The first thing we need to cover is, well, how do planes fly in the first place? Planes fly for two reasons. The first one is the wings, and the second one is the engine. So the wings are the most important. Wings produce lift. And the way wings produce lift is by having air flow over them. So as air flows over a wing, it basically creates a pressure differential. There's higher pressure underneath the wing than there is above the wing, and that pressure is pushing up. So as air comes over the wings, you have this pressure differential. The wing wants to rise. The second part is the engine. So planes can fly by themselves just with wings, but we need some form of propulsion. For example, gliders. Gliders don't have engines, but obviously, they can't get anywhere just on the ground. So they get towed into the air by another plane and then released. And then they can fly around. And I mean, if you use like updrafts, if you're by mountains, you could stay up for a while. But, that's the basic idea. Every plane can glide. Every plane is a glider because if it has wings, it's a glider. But the difference is that, you know, most planes have engines so that you can actually get off the ground, do something. So we understand those principles. We have the wings and we have the engine. The first thing you have to keep in mind, and this is really tricky and deceiving because even if you think you already knew this, like I did, just really, let this sink in. The wheels are free spinning on an airplane. Airplane wheels are not like a car, they're not connected to the engine. There's no transmission or anything. The wheels are just free spinning. The wheels have brakes so that you can slow down when you land and stuff like that. But to actually move forward, we use the engine. We use the propeller to push air back, to pull it. The engine and the propeller pull the plane forward. Okay, it's not like an engine in a car where it's the wheels moving that allow the plane to take off. It's the engine. It's that force. It's sucking the air and pushing it back, and that in turn pulls the plane forward. So really let that sink in. The wheels are free spinning, okay? The speed of the wheels, and this is another really important point, really let this sink in. The speed of the wheels does not really affect the plane's ability to move forward, Now, if we're talking realistically, every aircraft, there's a speed at which it has like a maximum ground speed where if you go so fast, you'll put too much stress on the wheels and the tires. The tire pressure might build up too much. They might get too hot. They might explode, you know, if they go too fast or get too hot. But that scenario is kind of that wouldn't really happen if we were doing this practically. I'll explain that a little bit later. But okay, so we have these principles down, right? Now, again, just I can't stress this enough. Really let that sink in. The wheels free spin. Their speed does not matter. Now, let me explain why the speed doesn't matter, because that you might be a little confused by that. Like of course the speed matters. Well, planes operate in the air. Like I mentioned just a second ago, they don't move forward by turning the wheels. They move forward by having the propeller spin, and the propeller sucks in air and pushes it back. And since the propeller itself is attached to the engine, which is attached to the plane, and that's all like one piece, when that propeller is pushing that air back, it pulls the plane forward. But this is in the air. We're not talking about the ground. The propeller is not making the plane move along the ground. The propeller is making the plane move in the air, which is then in turn making it move on the ground. A way to think about this is if we talk about a plane in flight. So let's say a plane is flying, I don't know, the plane is flying at 2,000 feet above the ground. It's flying directly north, but there is a wind that's coming from the north that is 70 knots. Okay, a super strong wind. In the aircraft, if we see on our airspeed indicator that we are going 70 knots, but we know this wind that's coming from directly in front of us is coming at us at 70 knots, well, then this would be a very peculiar sight, because if you were standing on the ground and you looked at this plane in the air, it would be still. It wouldn't be moving. It would be so strange. But this is possible because, like I mentioned, planes fly because of the wings. So as long as there is air going over the wings, the airplane is able to produce lift. And as long as enough air is going over the wings, it can, sustain that lift. This is no different than if you had a boat in a river going upstream. So let's say this river is going, the boats also use knots. So let's say this river is going at 10 knots. And this boat is going upstream at 10 knots. So on the boat, on your little speedometer, it says 10 knots. The boat would be still. If you were standing on the side of the river looking at the boat, it would be, stuck in place. Because since the water is pushing the boat back, but then the boat is pushing an equal amount back in the other direction, you don't go anywhere. It just stays still. So even though the boat is moving through the water, relative to the ground, it's not moving. This is exactly the same with airplanes. The airplane, in reference to the air, is moving at 70 knots. But to the ground, it's moving at 0. This is important in understanding the riddle, because now we understand that the airplane, in reference to the ground, doesn't really mean a lot, because the plane could still fly when its ground speed is 0. So even though the plane isn't covering any distance, it's still able to produce lift because of that air. Now, let's now come to the riddle. So we have our plane on the ground. The runway is a treadmill. Now, the cool thing about this riddle is when you first hear it, you really want the specifics. How is this treadmill moving? Is it moving at a constant speed? Is it moving at the takeoff speed of the airplane, or is it tracking the speed of the plane and matching that speed so that it makes sure the plane doesn't move, relative to someone observing, not on the treadmill? Kind of similar to what I was just saying with the wind, because it is the same principle. The treadmill is just like the wind. The treadmill is pushing the plane in one direction, but the plane can push itself in another direction. So those specifics really don't matter. And here's why. Because if we think of that example of the plane in the air with that 70 knot headwind, but the plane is also going 70 knots, so to someone looking from the ground, it's standing still. If you're in the plane, you could still accelerate. 70 knots is not that fast for the Cessna 172. We could easily accelerate to 110 knots. So we could do that if we were sitting in the plane at 2,000 feet going directly into this headwind. If we just go full throttle, we could speed up. So if we then sped up to, let's use that 110 knots. So we see on our airspeed indicator, our speedometer in the plane, that we're going 110 knots. Then yes, in reference to the air, we are going 110 knots. In reference to the ground, if someone was standing on the ground and they watched us accelerate, they would then see us start moving. They'd see us accelerated, then they'd see us stay at that constant, what would that be, 40 knots? Because that's the difference between what the wind is and what we're actually going. The wind is at 70 knots, but we're going 110 in the opposite direction. So our airspeed is 30. This is no different than the treadmill, because in the treadmill, you can also accelerate. And remember, the wheels are free spinning. So there's a little bit of friction involved, but it's really not enough to prevent the plane from taking off. It's pretty minuscule. We could even do this. We could start at the very end of the runway and the plane is stopped. We could start the treadmill. We could start accelerating the treadmill back indefinitely. But at the same time, we could speed up our plane and it wouldn't matter. The plane would be able to overcome the speed of the treadmill and then eventually go faster than the treadmill. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, the plane is dependent on air going over the wings. So, in the scenario in the riddle, it would be appropriate to assume that there is no wind in this scenario. If you were to assume that there was wind, I don't know why you would, and I feel like most wordings of the riddle, it's just kind of self-explanatory that there's no wind, because if there were, we could just use that plane standing still in the air argument, because, then if the wind is matching the takeoff speed of the plane, of course it can take off without moving. But so obviously there's no wind. No wind involved in this scenario. So the amount of time it would take the plane to take off would be increased because it would not be going from 0 knots to the takeoff speed, which is 55 knots. It would be going from like negative 50 knots or whatever the speed of the treadmill is. It would be negative that, and then it would have to accelerate to that 55 knots. But that's kind of a weird scenario. The most common scenario that I've heard, at least, is that the treadmill matches the speed of the plane. So as the plane accelerates, the treadmill will recognize this and start moving in the opposite direction at the same speed, and it will match the speed so that it will hold the plane still. And this seems like a stopping point. That's where I originally stopped when I heard this riddle, and that's why I said no, it couldn't take off, because the treadmill would always be able to match the speed. But remember those two key details. First, the propeller and the engine have nothing to do with the ground. It's all about the air. The reason a plane accelerates, even just on a normal runway, never mind this treadmill, the reason the plane accelerates is not because it's accelerating on the ground, it's because it's accelerating in the air, because the propeller is pushing air back and it's pulling the plane forward as a result. And then the other one is that the wheels are free spinning. The plane is not, the only way the plane is connected to the wheels is with wheel bearings. And then the wheels have, a brake disc and brake pads. And that's all they have. There's nothing else connected to the wheels. So the wheels' speed is really irrelevant to a plane taking off. It's just, accelerating with the propeller through the air and reaching that takeoff speed so that there's enough wind coming over the wings for it to produce enough lift to lift the entire weight of the aircraft into the air. So with that in mind, that you should be able to now realize that even if the treadmill constantly matched the speed, it wouldn't matter because the plane would be able to accelerate. The moment you put that throttle in and make that propeller start spinning, it's not really concerned about the wheels anymore. All you're going to get from the wheels is a little bit of rolling resistance that's translated through the ball bearings. Other than that, the plane is still accelerating like it normally would in any other scenario. It's just the propeller's taking that cut out of the air, pulling that air back, and pushing air back and pulling the plane forward, I should say. But, tomato, tomato, but you get the idea. Even when I say that, it still might not seem like that makes sense, but really just, kind of think about it, because that's what I had to do. Because I had heard that explanation, and I just couldn't take it. I was like, that just can't be the case. Because, maybe this or maybe that. But once you just really think about it long and hard, you realize it just clicks that the medium the plane is accelerating in is not the ground, it's the air. So now another funny thing about that specific scenario is in reality, what would actually happen is the treadmill would infinitely accelerate because the plane will be able to accelerate to its takeoff speed. Let's say the treadmill has like some sensing thing where it has a camera looking at the plane and it sees if the plane moves forward, it accelerates the treadmill. Well, what would happen is once the plane starts accelerating, the treadmill starts moving back, but the plane, since the wheels are free spinning, it doesn't slow down because there's very little friction with it's just rolling resistance that would be slowing the plane down through the wheels. Other than that, there's nothing slowing the plane down because the wheels are free spinning. So the plane would start moving forward. The treadmill would try to increase speed to make it go back, but it doesn't do anything. The plane still moves forward. So the treadmill will, it's just this never ending cycle, will continuously speed up and speed up and speed up to try and pull the plane back, and it would never work. If you had, now, like theoretically, the treadmill would only get to the takeoff speed of the airplane. Well, I don't know. I guess it kind of depends how this theoretical treadmill is programmed to work. But I think in the Cessna 172 example, and thinking like practically if such a treadmill actually existed and the power required to make it accelerate, I think the plane would be able to take off before the treadmill would reach some sort of like functional limitation, like it couldn't spin any faster or would overheat or too much stress on like the motor or the material. Like, I think the plane will be able to take off before then. I know some people use examples of airliners, like a big 747. In those cases, I don't even think such an experiment would be technically possible, but even then, all the same principles still apply. So, I know this was a really rough explanation. Maybe it didn't make sense, but I'm telling you, this has been the coolest 24 hours ever because I heard this riddle and oh, it's so tricky how deceiving it is because not only is it deceiving for people not really in the loop with, how airplanes work or basic aerodynamics, and they'll mistakenly think of the plane like a car. Even people like me who do have that basic understanding of airplanes, how they work, and how aerodynamics work in aviation with wings and how they produce lift. And the wheels, like I knew wheels were free spinning, but it didn't click right away because you kind of just ignore those details because you know that you know them already, so you pay less attention. And that's where I messed up. And I thought that was just so cool. And I know this sounds like crazy and over the top, but this really has been a major learning experience for me because it showed me that you really have to be careful when you're learning new information or trying to learn about new ideas because you really can't let your past experience and past knowledge block you from accepting those new ideas because that's what happened and it was catastrophic. I left a very embarrassing comment on Adam Savage's video that I will keep because I want you to see it and see me before I was able to accept that maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe even though I have knowledge and experience on the subject, maybe I'm just not taking enough time to learn. And that's why I really enjoyed this. And that's why I wanted to make this, because I wanted to share, well, first at least try my explanation, because I feel like that's kind of, just kind of how this works. If I'm going to make a video about the topic, might as well try and explain it. But also to, share how, I want to say profound, but how cool this moment was for me. So thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. If you have questions, put them in the comments. Like 5 people watch my videos, so I'm sure I'll be able to respond. If you still don't agree, please comment. I really do want to hear what you think is a counter argument for the riddle and why the plane can take off. I really am. So please leave those if you do, or if you're just still confused, or maybe something didn't make sense. Please comment. I'll be more than happy to try. At least that's the least I can do. All right. So thank you for listening. Have a good one.